Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on a company that's been getting a lot of attention lately in the financial world. It's called Nebius Group. And for this deep dive, we're looking at an episode of the Smart Investor podcast. They also have a really active Discord community that we took a look at. What's really interesting about this company is that they have a pretty dramatic story. Their revenue basically fell off a cliff, but some people are saying that they are poised to make a huge comeback.
Yeah, they've definitely had a wild ride. Nebius Group trades under the ticker symbol NBIS, and they've been on everyone's radar lately because there's a lot of talk that they could become a serious competitor in the data center market. They're taking on giants like Amazon and Google.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty bold statement to make. But before we get into all that, can you tell us a little bit more about this revenue plunge you mentioned? How bad are we talking here?
Oh, it was a big one. In 2020, Nebius was reporting a revenue of $8.9 billion. But get this, by 2023, that number had fallen to just $138 million. So that's a 98% drop.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is hard to believe. So what happened? What caused such a massive drop in revenue?
So Nebius hasn't always been focused on data centers. They actually started as a part of Yandex. Yandex is a Russian tech company that's sometimes called the Russian Google. And this big drop in revenue happened around the same time as some pretty major geopolitical events. And the company also made some significant internal changes.
Okay, so after they basically fell apart, how do they try to reinvent themselves?
Well, Arkady Velos, the former CEO of Yandex, took charge at Nebius, and he decided to take the company in a totally new direction. He shifted their focus to data centers as a service.
Data centers as a service. That sounds pretty interesting, but I'm not sure I totally understand what that means.
So basically, it's a way for companies to rent space and resources from a data center provider like Nebius, instead of having to build and maintain their own expensive data centers. So just imagine if you needed a giant server farm, but you didn't want to have to deal with all the hassle of managing it yourself. That's where Nebius comes in.
Oh, okay, so they're kind of like a landlord for the digital world. And is that a growing market?
Oh, absolutely. It's actually a booming sector right now because we're generating more and more data all the time. And that means that companies need access to reliable and scalable infrastructure.
Okay, so they're in the right place at the right time, it seems like. But can they actually pull it off? The smart investors seemed pretty confident about Nebius's future. They even gave some really impressive growth projections.
Yeah, they did. They projected a 400% increase in revenue for 2025. And they said that by 2026, Nebius could reach $17 billion in revenue.
Wait a second. They went from $138 million to a projected $17 billion. Those are some seriously optimistic numbers. What makes the smart investor so confident?
Well, they've done their research. They analyzed Nebius's financial history, looked at resources like Seeking Alpha and Google Notebook LM to get more information, and they even talked to their Discord community, which they call their tribe, to get a wider range of perspectives.
So it was a real team effort.
Yeah.
But how did they actually come up with these specific projections?
So they built some pretty sophisticated financial models, which let them project future earnings. And then they use a common valuation metric called the price-to-earnings ratio, or PE ratio, and that let them estimate potential stock prices.
Okay, that makes sense. But just for those of us who maybe aren't as familiar with financial jargon, can you explain the PE ratio a little more?
Sure, it's actually pretty simple. The PE ratio just compares a company's stock price to its earnings per share. So if a company has a high PE ratio, it often means that investors think the company is going to grow a lot in the future.
So even though Nebius had that huge downturn, investors still believe they have potential.
That's right. The smart investor actually used a PE ratio of 25 for Nebius, which is pretty high. And based on that, they came up with a target price of $146 per share by 2028.
Wow. That's over 4 times its current price.
Mm.
I can see why this is generating so much buzz. But we should probably remember that this is just one analysis, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's important to remember this is not financial advice. Investing always has risks, and it's super important to do your own research before making any decisions.
Great advice. So we have this company, Nebius, with this fascinating history and some really bold predictions for the future. What are the main things that someone who's just learning about them for the first time should keep in mind?
Nebius is definitely a company worth watching. They're in a market that's growing really fast. They've got ambitious goals. And some analysts think they could make a huge comeback. But it's also important to remember that there are always risks involved. Nothing is guaranteed.
That's a great point. It sounds like a classic high-risk, high-reward situation. But what would it actually take for Nebius to become a major player in this really competitive data center market? What are some of the challenges they're going to have to overcome? So we were just talking about the challenges Nebius we'll have to face. I mean, it's not going to be easy taking on companies like Amazon and Google, is it?
It's a tough road ahead for sure. It's a classic David versus Goliath situation. But the smart investor actually thinks that Nebius has a few things going for them, a few advantages that could help them really get a foot in the door.
Oh, I'm all ears. What are these secret weapons that could give them an edge?
Well, first of all, they think that Nebius's connection to Yandex could actually be a good thing. Now, of course, there are some geopolitical risks there, but it also means that Nebius has a lot of experience and they can operate at a pretty large scale. Remember, they were handling billions of dollars in revenue as part of Yandex. That kind of experience operating a really complex infrastructure at that scale is pretty valuable.
So they're not exactly starting from scratch. They have a track record of handling complex operations, even if it was in a different context. What else?
The smart investor also pointed out that Nebius could be in a position to offer lower prices than their competitors. I mean, Amazon and Google, they have these massive data centers, but that also means they have huge overhead costs. And Nebius being a smaller player, they might be able to offer more competitive pricing, especially as they grow.
It's interesting. So they could try to attract customers who are looking for a good deal, but pricing alone isn't going to be enough, is it?
No, of course not. And the smart investor knows that. They also think that Nebius might try to focus on more niche markets. So instead of trying to be everything to everyone, they could focus on specific industries or types of businesses. And they could offer solutions that are tailored to their needs.
Oh, so they're thinking about specialization rather than trying to compete head-to-head with the big guys in every single area.
Exactly. Think about it like this. Amazon and Google are like these giant department stores. They offer a little bit of everything. But Nebius could be more like a boutique, offering high-quality, customized solutions for very specific needs.
I like that analogy. So they're playing to their strengths and focusing on areas where they can really stand out. But what about the technology itself? I mean, we've talked about their experience and their potential strategies, but what about the actual nuts and bolts of their data centers?
That's a really important question. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of details from our sources, but the smart investor did say that Nebius might try to focus on sustainability. That could be a big selling point for them.
Sustainability, how does that apply to data centers?
Data centers use a lot of energy. They're notorious energy hogs. So Nebius could really differentiate themselves by investing in energy-efficient technologies and renewable energy sources. That could be really appealing to businesses that are trying to be more environmentally conscious.
That's a smart move. It taps into a trend that's only getting bigger, and it positions them as a company that's thinking about the future. Speaking of trends, the smart investor mentioned something about Nebius riding a wave that's already building. What do they mean by that?
They were talking about the trend of decentralization in the tech industry. More and more companies are moving away from those traditional in-house data centers, and they're switching to cloud-based solutions. And that shift is creating a huge opportunity for companies like Nebius.
Right. So they're not just trying to create a new market. They're trying to tap into a market that's already growing really quickly. But this whole story raises a pretty interesting question. What if Nebius actually pulls it off? What if they actually do become a serious competitor to Amazon and Google? How do you think the big guys would react?
That's a great question. And the smart investor actually talked about that a little bit. It's pretty unlikely that Amazon and Google would just sit back and watch their market share disappear. They're both incredibly competitive, so they would probably respond pretty aggressively.
So we could see a data center arms race.
It's definitely possible. We could see some really intense price competition, a ton of innovation, maybe even a bunch of strategic acquisitions as all these companies fight for control of the market. It would be pretty exciting to watch.
And it could be good for consumers too, right? Competition usually leads to better products and lower prices.
Exactly. If the data center market becomes more competitive, it could drive down costs, improve efficiency, and lead to a lot of new innovations across the industry. But the smart investor also pointed out that Nebius could become an acquisition target.
Oh, right. So one of the big companies could just buy them out if they start to become a real threat.
It's definitely a possibility. It wouldn't be surprising at all. I mean, Nebius has a lot of experience and a lot of potential, so they could be a really attractive target for a company that wants to expand its data center business quickly.
So there are a lot of possible scenarios here. Nebius could disrupt the market. They could trigger a huge wave of competition, or they could get acquired by one of the giants. It sounds like things are about to get a lot more interesting in the data center world. But let's zoom out for a second. This whole story isn't just about technology and business, is it? There are some geopolitical factors to consider as well.
You're absolutely right. Nebius's connection to Russia is definitely something that investors and potential clients are going to be watching closely, even though they're an independent company now.
And speaking of risks, Nebius's connection to Russia is something that the smart investor talk about directly. What did they have to say about that? And how could it affect Nebius in the future?
Well, the smart investor acknowledged that the geopolitical situation is always changing, and Nebius's Russian roots could create some uncertainty and some risk. But they also said that Nebius is really working hard to diversify its operations and to build trust with international clients.
So they're aware of the challenges,
Yeah.
and they're taking steps to address them. But it's definitely a factor that adds a lot of complexity to this whole story. It reminds us that business and geopolitics are often closely connected, especially in the tech world.
Absolutely. And for Nebius, navigating all these geopolitical complexities while also trying to establish themselves in a really competitive market is going to be tricky.
It's a real balancing act. But we've been focusing a lot on external factors, like the competition and the global political landscape. What about internal factors, like the people at Nebius, their culture, their leadership? How does the smart investor see those things playing a role in their potential success?
That's a really good question, and it's something that the smart investor actually highlighted as a potential strength for Nebius. They've created a really collaborative and community-driven work environment, and they think that gives them an advantage when it comes to attracting and keeping top talent.
So they're not just building data centers. They're building a company culture that encourages innovation and attracts the best people.
Exactly. The smart investor also thinks that Nebius's leadership team is a big asset. They have a really impressive track record of success in the tech world, and they're known for having a strong vision and being able to execute their plans effectively.
So they have the experience, the vision, and the team to potentially pull this off. But wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. Their incredible rise and fall, their big ambitions, the potential for market disruption, the geopolitical factors, and even the importance of their company culture. It's clear that there's a lot more to come in the Nebius story. Did the smart investor have any other insights about what the future might hold?
Well, they emphasize that the future of Nebius and the future of the data center market in general is really hard to predict. There are a lot of variables involved, and it's impossible to say for sure what's going to happen. But they did leave listeners with one final thought-provoking question.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What was the question?
They asked their listeners to think about the ethical and societal implications of Nebius's potential success. That's something that we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive.
Excellent. So be sure to join us for part 3, when we'll be discussing the broader impact of Nebius's journey and what it could mean for the future of data privacy, security, and access in this rapidly changing digital world. All right, so welcome back for the last part of our Nebius Group deep dive. We've talked about their crazy past, their big plans for the future, and how they could potentially shake up the whole data center market. But now I think it's time to shift gears a little bit and talk about the ethical and societal implications of their potential success.
You're right. It's a really important part of the conversation. And it's something that often gets lost in all the excitement about market analysis and financial predictions. Technology, especially when it comes to data, has a huge impact on our lives, so we need to think about the bigger picture.
Absolutely. So let's get into those thought-provoking questions that the smart investor asks their listeners. One of the first things that comes to mind when we talk about Nebius potentially handling massive amounts of data is privacy. What do they have to say about that?
Well, they really stress the importance of transparency. If Nebius wants to build trust with its clients and with the public, they need to be really clear about how they collect, store, and use data. No more hiding behind all that complicated legal jargon in their privacy policies.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that clear and easy to understand privacy policies are super important.
Yeah.
But even if they're transparent about what they're doing, how can we be sure that our data is actually protected? Data breaches seem like they're happening all the time these days.
Oh, absolutely. Security is crucial. The smart investor emphasized that Nebius needs to have really strong security measures in place. Things like encryption, multi-factor authentication, regular security audits. They need to do everything they can to keep that data safe.
It sounds like they're going to need a really great security team to stay one step ahead of the bad guys. But security is about more than just technology, right?
Right. You're exactly right. Technology is important, but it's not the whole story. The smart investor also talked about the importance of having a strong security culture within the company. Every single employee, from the CEO all the way down to the interns, needs to understand how important data security is, and they all need to be following best practices.
So it's a combination of technology policies and people. But we also can't forget about all the legal stuff. The laws around data privacy are constantly changing, aren't they?
Oh yeah, definitely. The smart investor reminded everyone that Nebius is going to have to deal with a really complex web of regulations, especially as they start to expand globally. Different countries have different laws, and staying compliant with all of them is going to be a huge challenge.
It's a lot to keep track of. But getting it right is super important.
Mhm.
If they have a big data breach, it could be really bad. Not just for Nebius, but for their clients and for all the people whose data is compromised.
Absolutely. A data breach could destroy their reputation, make people lose trust in them, and even lead to lawsuits. There's a lot at stake.
So it's a big responsibility to handle all that sensitive data. But let's look at the other side of the coin for a second. Could Nebius's focus on data centers as a service actually have some positive impacts on society?
That's a really interesting question. And it's something that the smart investor touched on as well. They said that by making data center resources more accessible and more affordable, Nebius could actually help level the playing field for smaller businesses and startups, companies that might not have the money to build their own data centers.
That's a great point. It could give more entrepreneurs and innovators a chance to participate in the digital economy.
Exactly. And if the data center market becomes more competitive with new companies like Nebius joining the game, it could lead to more innovation, which would benefit everyone.
So it's a complex issue with both potential risks and potential rewards. It reminds us that technology is a powerful tool, and it can be used for good or for bad.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to think about the ethical and societal implications of technology, along with all the business and financial aspects.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into Nebius Group. We've talked about their wild ride, their ambitious goals, how they could disrupt the market, and the ethical considerations around data privacy and access. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I think it shows just how dynamic and fast-paced the tech industry is, and how important it is to stay informed and engaged.
As we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The future of Nebius Group and the future of technology in general is being shaped right now by the choices that companies, governments, and individuals are making every single day. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Nebius Group.